Good morning. It's a real pleasure this morning to have a professor of human geography who's also in the business department at the University of Gothenburg. She's Marie Stenseke, and she's going to be talking with us about how she sees the relationship between tourism and biodiversity. Marie, we're really keen to hear from you, particularly given your research and your involvement with business as well as geography. So, what's your view?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I'd say first I will talk from the perspective that, or my role in the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, since I serve as a co-chair of the multidisciplinary expert panel that kind of oversees the scientific quality of that work. And of course, I have that kind of, I'm appointed to that role due to my research I've been carrying out in interdisciplinary context before and working mainly from a landscape perspective. And from that, I will also refer to the work done in IPBES, kind of give my reflections in combination to it. But what I say is kind of my, I talk here in my own person. I need to state that not as a representative of IPBES, of course. But based on that, I'd say that there are many problems with tourism when you look at it from an environmental side and from the kind of sustainability challenges that the world faces. When it comes to climate change, they're quite well known, the kind of the CO2 emissions and all the travels related to tourism. When it comes to biodiversity, it's less known and it's less kind of measured. For biodiversity, the main root or cause to loss of species is land use changes. That's the main driver of change. And there are other drivers such as invasive species, pollution and exploitation of species that also plays into it, together with climate change. But by that, I'd say that we need to recognize that there are many challenges within sustainability connected to tourism, but I would like to more think about today to talk about tourism as a part of the solution as well, because I do think there's ways that we need to work on it and tourists can contribute to it. One of the leverage points that the global assessment of IPBES identified was awareness raising or change of minds and transformative change. Including that we need to more reflect on what is a good life and more be aware of our relation to the rest of nature. And in that sense, I certainly think that going out, visit to nature areas help us to see kind of how we interrelate with other species and also give us experiences that brings quality to our lives. And I think that also will help us to be responsible.
It's perhaps worth saying there, Marie, that my first, I knew about the theory of sea level rise and climate change, but when I was actually taken into a mangrove by a local guide who showed me how you could see it in that mangrove, it really came home in a quite different way. And maybe part of the answer is that we need to work on the guides to make them more able to communicate those messages in the landscapes that they're in.
Yeah, I certainly think that is a part of it. I mean, I'd like to see it to refer kind of some basic social science kind of approaches to talk both about structure and agency. I mean, we have as individuals and as individual tourists where we go, we have the agency certainly to act, to get aware of our imprints and then make sure that we make them as small as possible by our travels, by our consumption, by our kind of what we do when we get out into nature areas. But I also think there are structures we need to work with to facilitate that that more addresses the tourism industry, so to speak. And that is kind of to set up standards, measures, to see what are both the dependencies to raise the awareness, but also the imprints we make. And the comparison then to climate change is that, I mean, in biodiversity, there's no such a kind of simple equal entity as the CO2 molecule.
Yeah.
Because it's not interchangeable. What's the biodiversity in the Amazons compared to in northern Sweden or in the Alps or in Thailand. So this is a tricky issue. And we have had some seminars and workshops in the university where I work, where we discuss how could we better measure the imprints of biodiversity, because there's a need out there in the business industry to find ways to measure and to compare. I mean, I mean, setting up labels like ecotourism or nature-based tourism, that's of course good, but we need to also develop and agree on a kind of a way to measure what is these imprints we make. How do we communicate in, and how do we monitor it? To make sure that it's not just a label that is the kind of final result, but it is what is really happening on the ground where we are tourists, or the tourist industry is active. And of course then, it's also a challenge then to combine that with the climate change challenges, so which is have their way of measuring. So this is not instead of, but as a necessary complement to it to find sustainable ways. What IPBES has also been working a lot with, and I mean, I'd say we have touched upon tourism in the reports we have made. We have not have yet a report on assessment focused on tourism, which I personally would say would be well motivated. But anyway, what IPBES has been doing is also made aware or shown the connection between right-based approaches, inequity, and biodiversity, and specifically so working with indigenous people and local communities, which are in many places inhabit or have access or kind of stake in beautiful nature areas where tourists also go and visit. And it's important not just then to take into account the imprints of biodiversity as such or the climate, but also what it may do to the people inhabiting the areas. If we don't consider also the people and the social and their economies in this context, we will not solve the problem, because there will be kind of, we push them out and push them to be less sustainable if we kind of don't recognize that there is an economic aspect also to their livelihoods.
Do you think, Marie, that tourism can generate enough benefits for the communities around these landscapes to enable them to have the kind of increase in their standard of living that they aspire to? Or are we just asking too much of the industry to be able to deliver those kinds of volumes of money?
I think it's a tricky issue, and I mean, I refer to colleagues that do research in more developing geography or developing studies. It certainly shows that you cannot generalize too much, because it's different for different places, and you can also not generalize kind of who is local and who gains from certain benefits, because sometimes it could be just a few gaining while the majority of the population is not gaining. So solution might not be spread out, and many will still have to rely on kind of poaching or getting into areas where we really would like protection. And added to that, sorry to say, but we also have the corruption spread over the world that kind of we need to be concerned about and consider when we look for solutions. Yeah,
absolutely.
But I would like to say that, I mean, this how to measure, I'd like and invite the tourism industry to also engage in how can we develop these issues. It's not just for researchers, but also for practitioners and people out there, see what could work and how could this kind of fit into the operations carried out. And we have up to date some experience of certification when it comes to forestry products or fisheries, and could that even more and strongly be transformed, also to be used into the tourism industry. yeah, I could add also that we have an upcoming assessment on business and biodiversity, and I'm happy for that, which means that we will specifically be looking into this issue of what do we know already about measures, about the dependence on biodiversity, but also the impact on biodiversity, and what are the knowledge gaps. And the kind of little framing of it we've done so far before we kind of start now scoping it for real. Then we include tourism and forestry, together with forestry and agriculture and mining. But tourism is certainly an interesting field, or an important field, since it's so widespread and so economically important all over the globe.
Much of that resonates with my own experience, Marie, I must say, but one of the most depressing periods in my life was actually undertaking research in 3 national park systems in India, Indonesia and Zimbabwe, looking for these mythical ecotourists and the contribution that they made to biodiversity conservation. And I have to say that for all the trumpeting of ecotourism by individual businesses who use it largely, I think, as a marketing ploy, when we looked at the national parks, we couldn't find those tourists at all. That the difference between an ordinary mass tourist and an ecotourist actually in the park and in the environment around the park was very difficult to identify.
And that's why, I mean, I certainly agree with you, and that's why I stress that we cannot just rely on labels that has kind of no content, but we need to develop and see and agree on how to measure it and how to compare between various kinds of businesses as well. I mean, to some extent, we will probably have to measure, compare apples and pears, but at least we need to search for certain standards and fill the gaps that are not there. And I would say, together with the tourism industry and tourism organizations, because just calling something ecotourism doesn't make it ecotourism, of course.
In fact, I mean, the public, fortunately, the consumers have realised that. I think in most source markets now, they're not very convinced by that label. But it's been deserted, as it were, although there are still businesses, particularly in Australia and New Zealand, and Australia and the US, who hang on to it. But in most other source markets, it's really lost its purchase power, I think. So business is ceasing to use it. But one of the things, given that you've worked a lot on landscape, Marie, one of the things that worries me enormously is that tourists expect the landscape to be for free. We don't expect to pay for a view, do we? We expect somebody else to maintain that landscape so that we can enjoy it. But we expect the view to be for free. And I think that's a really, a quite deep fundamental problem, isn't it?
That's an interesting question. I mean, you know, Sweden is one of the few countries in the world that have the right of public access.
Yes, that's right.
So I certainly wouldn't, you will not hear me saying that we should start paying for the views in Sweden.
No, of course.
And I mean, some parts of the world, like my own, is very sparsely populated. I think in average now we have come up to the level of 22 inhabitants per square kilometer, though it's much more sparsely populated in the north than in the south. Yeah. So of course here we have space that in many cases it's gains from trampling by foot, because it's kind of enhances some of the biodiversity that but on the average and broadly, I mean, this you need to, I mean, polluters pay principle should also, of course, apply to tourism, I would say, if you can transfer that into tourism. And we also have to recognize that some of the very vulnerable ecosystems we need to leave. We need to let at least recover. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a biologist, I can say especially where, but maybe the coral reefs need that kind of protection. I would guess at least the few ones we have here up in the north, that's a few that we need to leave them. So I mean, you cannot pay for things that you can never repair, of course. So that is up to a certain degree that you can pay. And when you talk about paying for landscape, I mean, of course, if we're going to have a more equal, larger, more equality on the planet, we need to make sure that the payment stays with these that do the job. But I'm glad you phrased it that people manage the landscape, because sometimes and too often we think of areas as wild, while there have been humans inhabiting them for thousands and thousands of years. So it's a kind of image of a wild landscape when we kind of then classify people, some people on the earth, as wild as well is very incorrect, I'd say. And we need to realize that we are so much dominating the planet that what is happening is up to us, and it's more political decisions than kind of nature deciding.
I'm very aware that some of the most beautiful landscapes in Britain, the ones that I really appreciate, are actually the product of human intervention over hundreds of years. And we've wrecked a lot of the biodiversity in our own countries in Europe. But obviously in Africa they should maintain it, shouldn't they? There's a real problem, I think, about our own track record in terms of what we've done and what we're expecting other countries to do.
Oh yeah, and in our areas, I think we need to consider more about restoration. Yeah. But we need also to realize that humans are part of it. I mean, in many parts of Europe, humans came after the last ice age together with a number of species and before number of species. So it's not that there is kind of some kind of wild area before us, but well, in Scandinavia, it was kind of the naked shores where the canoes stranded at. And that's not what we're gonna reshape. So yeah, and just think about it, I couldn't help but just, of course, in these days come to mind the effects of COVID, where I presume in many countries they've done, like in Sweden, there have been more holidays at home.
Yeah, absolutely.
And not sure how interesting that is for the tourism industry, but I think this kind of, that tourists always had to be exotic. I think you missed that lot of exotic things around the corner.
Yes, there's plenty of exotic at home. I was just yesterday visiting some friends who've just bought a small apple orchard, and right on their doorstep is going to be the reintroduction of the European bison. It should be the first time in the UK. So these things are happening, but interestingly, that's not being funded by tourism. That's being funded by charity. And the chances of actually seeing a European bison in that woodland would be very small. They're quite secretive animals, but nonetheless, some reintroduction is occurring, and that will be good for the ecosystem. Marie, thank you very much indeed for that. Lots of food for thought in there, and I think what we need is some more creativity about the way in which tourism and visitors interact with landscapes if we're going to be successful in maintaining them. But thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for asking me. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.